Okay, I now call to order the Thursday, September 26, 2024 meeting of the City of Sugar Land Planning and Zoning Commission. Good evening, commissioners. Good evening, staff, and everyone listening. We'll move right through our agenda, starting with item 2, public comment. Do we have anyone signed up for public comment?
No, Chair, we do not.
Hearing none, we'll move on to item 3A, consideration of and action on the minutes of the August 13th and August 22nd, 2024 meetings. Those were in the materials circulated prior to the meeting. Any discussion on the minutes? I've got a motion to approve by Commissioner Brown and a second from Commissioner Landine. We'll hand vote. That motion passes unanimously among the members present. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 0 for the record. And we will move on to item 4A, review of and discussion on breaking down barriers to development. I see Ruth and an impressive cast of other folks who may be addressing us.
Yes.
I will I guess we'll hear hopefully from you and Jessica. That's what it says here.
Yes.
All yours.
Thank you. Good evening, Chair and Commissioners. So yes, tonight we are here for our workshop number 3 on redevelopment. I'm going to get us kicked off, and then Jessica Rodriguez and Jessica Hubble will also be joining me momentarily. So as a reminder, we have been doing this workshop series and with the goal to prepare you for kind of the continuing and upcoming work related to redevelopment. And we have been doing a series of workshops. We've done 2 so far. Tonight's our 3rd, and then we are preparing for our 4th one, the public input in a NIMBY world. So talking about barriers to redevelopment. So just generally, redevelopment faces a variety of different challenges and barriers. Some of these are similar or the same as what you might have in a greenfield development, but in the case of redevelopment, they're amplified. In other cases, those barriers don't exist at all for greenfield development or, kind of developing raw land. And so what we're going to do tonight is walk you through what some of those barriers are, and then what we can and can't do to address some of them. These barriers come from kind of a variety of sources, both kind of academic and planning professional materials. We've also done some engagement with local property owners and developers. And then, as some of you may recall, a couple of years ago, we were working on the RAC&NAC land use plan implementation project, and we did a phase 1 and a phase 2. We had a consultant that we were working with. Part of that effort was actually engaging with local property owners and developers. And some of what we heard was barriers to redevelopment. And so we've incorporated some of that feedback into this presentation. And so I just kind of wanted to remind you of that for those that were here, and let you know a little bit about it for those who may not have been around at that time. So just getting started with what are the barriers to redevelopment. So we've broken it down to a handful of kind of categories here. So there's market and economic realities, financial, logistical or site constraints, property owners, regulatory, and then community. Looking at the market and economic realities, so there are some just kind of broader economic conditions that impact development. This is kind of a duh, but it is a reality, right? So any kind of recession or instability and just kind of general economic conditions can cause difficulty with getting financing for projects. Interest rates are based on the state of economy. So again, that impacts a development ability to move forward. Then you also have just the market demand for a new project or a development, just depending on, what the city's vision and what the community's vision is, that can impact whether the market can impact whether there's really demand for that. Looking at land costs, I'm sure you all are aware that land costs in Sugar Land are pretty high. And we have found that that really is a barrier for redevelopment in some of our areas, because you can go just a few miles out to, Richmond, Rosenberg, or even more so unincorporated Fort Bend County, and get land for a lot less expensive. And in much of those cases, you're talking about greenfield. And so you're starting from scratch. And so that's also a lot easier for developers. And then there's just the reality of existing lease requirements. So, you have property owners that have multi-tenant spaces, And they have multiple year commitments with various tenants, and a lot of times those may not all happen at the same time. And so if you're thinking about a strip center redeveloping, that's a very complicated proposition. And then in a lot of cases, we actually have, even if we as a city look at our parking spaces and kind of dial back the requirements, there are retailers that have specific requirements for what they want to see at their site. So I know I've heard about like some of the anchors at the mall that have certain minimum requirements for parking. So even though we know that those parking spaces don't get used because Black Friday isn't as much of a thing anymore, they still have those kind of archaic requirements.
Ruth, are you calling that out because it's like, is that a for instance, or is that one that jumps out? Parking spaces. It seems like there would be a longer list of
Yeah.
like those things. I just didn't know if you were using that as a
Um,
thought starter or if it was like something that's a.
I mean, I would say it's a big deal.
The commercial markets, it's a big deal, Taylor.
Okay.
Yeah, it is.
And I'd say it's a pretty significant barrier to redevelopment. But it's also food for thought. Take it where you'd like. Okay, so the next kind of category is financial. So the cost of either demolishing or remediating existing buildings is expensive. So whether a site is going to, or a developer is looking at removing existing improvements or trying to address what's there, use what's there, and then fix it up. It's more often than not more expensive to do that than it is just to like scrape and start from scratch, or to have a green field where you're starting from scratch. Also, a lot of times you're looking at having to move utilities where, you know, sometimes they're literally going through like the middle of a parking lot, or a lot of times they will. And that is, you know, an interesting proposition to try and make adjustments to that. Or working around existing improvements that maybe you want to save, whether it's trees or historic buildings or whatever. Again, you're not starting from scratch. You're having to kind of work around existing things. And then, like I was saying, it's just generally more expensive to repurpose existing buildings than building new ones. One example here locally is the former 24-hour fitness building down on 59 that's been vacant for quite a while. There have been a variety of potential tenants, users that I know the city has spoken to about taking on that space. And that building was built to be a fitness center, and it's got big like structural posts that run through the middle of the building that just make it hard to repurpose into something else. And so that's just a real specific example of what that can look like in the real world. There's also just an uncertainty from a return on investment standpoint with redevelopment. Lenders feel like it's just riskier to lend for those kind of projects than when it comes to greenfield projects, and which then makes the funding a little bit harder to get. And so generally, it's just harder to deal with the financial side, which is really what we've seen with some of the big projects that we've talked about recently with both Lake Point and Imperial. Those projects have not moved forward at this point because the finances just have not been able to come together.
Can I jump in on that?
Sure.
I had a very specific question about that. So
I may not be able to-
I only know what I read. And I read in Community Impact
Oh,
last month, there was an article that said that with respect to Lake Point and Imperial, that neither of those properties is currently under contract. My question is, you've laid out several barriers to redevelopment. These are the two kind of marquee redevelopment programs that we want here.
Mhm.
Do you think the reasons why those projects are not moving forward right now are because of any of these barriers that you've mentioned, or for other reasons? That it would be good to know what those were.
I know that the funding, like getting the investors to back the project, has been an issue for those projects. And I don't know if
Financing's the
Jessica.
other piece.
yeah.
It's the financial from the banks, the investors and everything for both properties.
Okay.
And the city's commitment of what they're willing to do, right? Filling that gap.
But are the banks unwilling because they believe it's risky?
Yeah.
Or,
No, it's just the state of the market right now. I mean, a lot of times when you see when like presidential elections come on, you know, and where the interest rates are, this tends to happen. And so you have to kind of wait for the market to flush itself out, which will happen. Yeah, you see this a lot during presidential elections for sure.
I'll wait till you get to the next one.
Okay.
I have a follow-up to that, so.
Okay, and remember, right now I'm just going through what the barriers are, and then in a little bit, we're also going to talk about what we're trying to do to address the ones that we are able to. And so one of the things I think that a lot of people don't think about, this was something that we heard through the stakeholder feedback with the land use plan implementation project, was that for commercial centers, redeveloping into like a mixed use center really isn't appealing because it's overly complicated and it's hard. And they're already making a profit, like they're already performing well enough that they're making the money that they want to make. And so they don't really have an incentive to go and do something different than what is already happening today. I think a lot of people don't really think about that. They think that a corporation should do the right thing for the community and make their property beautiful or make it into something better than what it is today. But the reality is it has to make financial sense for that company that owns the property, for them to be incentivized to do anything different. And even then, they still might not. So when we look at some of the logistical and site constraints, this is really dealing with, you know, the site specific. So in some cases, you have inadequate public infrastructure for redevelopment, you know, whether that's water and sewer, or you might have inadequate roadways or, you know, just different infrastructure that is going to cost more money than for the developer potentially to have to put in to bring it up to the standards. A little bit like we talked about before, you know, it's difficult to work around those existing improvements. In this case, you know, you have a building in the middle of it, you know, let's say the char house, we got to work around that, right? And so you can't just make your dream and come up with some grand plan, like you're having to kind of start with the starting point. A lot of these sites are also limited by stuff that's going on around it. So like in the case of Imperial, for example, you have the railroad, you have 90A. A lot of our other sites that we've identified for redevelopment are on Highway 6 or 59. And so those can become barriers to reinventing those places into something different. We also have a lot of sites that are, even if they are like a large strip center, they look like it's one holistic development. It's actually fragmented into small pieces. And I'm going to show you some examples of that, where they've kind of been parceled out in ways that you would probably never imagine that they would. And in some cases, you have a lot of different owners. And so that makes it more difficult to redevelop as well. And this was one of the things that we heard from our stakeholders during the land use plan implementation. So just as an example, this is the Sugar Creek Village property, which is over, this is where, what is the taco place there at the corner? Berry Hill, thank you, is located. And there used to be Gerland's grocery store here eons ago, right? And it's, you know, cycled through several different tenants since then. So this property was developed in the 1960s or so, which makes it about 60 years old. But right now they're only at about 10% vacancy. So this property has had its ups and downs over the years. I think the last time we pulled this data, it was at like 50%. So that to me is kind of interesting.
You've got an owner there that takes very good care of that property too,
Mhm.
and that plays into the occupancy rate.
That's a good point. Yeah. For a 60-year-old site, it's in pretty decent shape. In this case, you have 4 different parcels and 3 different owners. So it's color coded based on the ownership. So you have one owner that has most of, you know, kind of the big center and then the side piece, but then there's 2 different owners up there in the corner. So if somebody wanted to come in and do some kind of redevelopment, holistic redevelopment, they would have to get those pieces and, you know, put them together. And then just from the point of these properties are functioning, you know, as a 60-year-old site, there is a really good chance that this mortgage is paid off. It probably was a long time ago. And so any money that they're making off of those tenant leases are just going either into their pockets or back into the, into the site. And so, just for example, as they contributed $200,000 in sales tax. So you had to have a certain amount of, sales to be able to get to that. So actually doing pretty well for a 60-year-old development. One that's a little bit newer, another example is the Market at Town Center, which is right across the street from us here. It's about 30 years old. It only has less than 5% retail vacancy, so that site doing pretty well. This is an example where you have 19 different parcels. So when you just look at that site, you think, oh, that's just all one development, but you can see how they've split off each of these tenant spaces in the parking lots that are in front of them are actually have the potential to be under different ownership. Right now, it is under quite a bit of common ownership. So there could be some opportunity in this case. But again, in some of our other centers, you actually have, multiple property owners. And then of course, those sites that are out on Highway 6 there are owned under different ownership. So so just a couple of examples for you there. And speaking of property owners, property owners really aren't developers most of the time. And so they're not looking for that. They don't, a lot of times they don't have a vision oh, I want to do something great here. It's really just, I own this strip center. It makes money. I'm going to put enough into it where I can continue to have tenants in it. Like you mentioned, the property owner that takes good care of the Sugar Creek 1960s Center. So, and for some, they might be like, oh, yeah, it'd be cool to do something different, but they don't necessarily have the expertise or the financial wherewithal to do something different to, redevelop the site. We also have quite a few, retail centers that are owned by a group, a corporation, and it's just one number on a spreadsheet in their portfolio. And so, they're up in New York or out in California, and they're not looking at our little, 12, 15 acre sites going, I wonder what I could do different in Sugar Land, and so there's just that kind of anonymity, I guess. There's also the reality that redevelopment isn't just going to put back what was there before. So, a lot of our sites, people think, oh, we just need to tear it down and build something that looks prettier, that's newer, that's, nicer than what is there today. But in order for any of that redevelopment to make sense, you really have to densify or intensify the use. To add value. I mean, that's really what it's about, is adding value so that you can justify the cost of that investment. But you do have some cases where maybe there isn't a complete replacement of buildings, but a modification of existing buildings. So I actually went on vacation with my family in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee a couple of years ago, and we went to this really cool place. And I later realized in looking at Google that it was actually a redevelopment. And so I was like, hey, how about that? Planner Neck never takes her planner hat off, even on vacation. So this was the original site that I think it looks like it's pretty vacant. And then this was under construction, where you can see they still have those end anchors there. And then what they turned it into is they actually tore out this middle section and rebuilt these this tenant spaces at the back, which you can see in the green here. And they put in this open green space. They also did some reworking of the parking lot. But these are just some pictures that I took of the green space there that in this case, they didn't intensify the land use so much, but they added value in a different kind of way. They created a different kind of space than what was there before. Okay, another really important barrier that we obviously talk to you all about a lot is the regulatory barriers. So the regulations, things like requirements for parking, requirements for detention, that takes up land that can be used for development, which then eats into that return on investment. There's also the issue of, is what's being proposed permitted under the zoning regulations or other standards? And then, as we've talked about quite a bit with this group over time, just the process time, the length of time that it takes to get a project through the process. So you probably recall, we heard through our stakeholder feedback that, the process is overly complicated, overly complex. We also heard that there's a lot of rules and layers of process that really complicate things and are a barrier. Because you're not only dealing with the city, but you're also dealing with the POA, and the regulations are different and how you address them are different.
And all of this ties back to what you talked about in the beginning, which is the financial piece of this.
At the end of the day,
At the end of the day, it does, and I'll tell a quick story. We're gonna build a building in Conroe. And it's a carbon copy of something I built in 2008 on clay in the Beltway, and it's gonna go from 600,000 to $1.9 million. And a lot of that is the infrastructure that you're talking about. It's the underground detention. It's the POA stuff that's required. Again, there's inflationary
Mhm.
drivers to this, but a lot of it is the requirements of the land as well.
Same.
The more that you put that in place, you drive that number up and you say, well, why isn't anyone redeveloping? Well, part of that is what municipalities and governments and POAs or HOAs are putting on those properties.
Right, right.
I have two questions.
Yes, sir.
May I?
Please.
One, with respect to the last slide,
One of the
okay, on the
previous ones.
inflexible PD process and cumbersome processes and perceived costs,
Mhm.
here, I'm gonna form the question. My question is this: have we not taken huge steps forward, at least with respect to Lake Point,
For sure. For sure,
by the modifications that this body has recommended?
absolutely.
Okay, that's number one. Secondly, I get all this about all these barriers. And I read in the Business Journal today that a development company well known to Sugar Land is sinking $1 billion into the West Chase area to make, quote, the new city center.
Mhm.
They dealt with multiple owners.
Mhm.
They were fortunate. It sounded like to me, I only know what I read, it sounded to me like they were successful in buying up the property. They're tearing down the old, I guess it's Halliburton offices.
Mhm.
So to a layperson, that sounds a lot like the kinds of things we'd like to do here.
Sure.
And my question is, okay, if it's the economy, well, I'm not sure that's right, because why is that? Why is $1 billion getting spent in West Chase and not here? I mean, the same issues have got to be there with the concerns about the costs and the return on investment
Yes.
and all this stuff. So that's my observation, and I guess the question that and I'm not asking for an immediate answer, but a question that I think we should think about is, why is a project like that able to move forward and actually get to the shovels in ground stage, whereas projects that we have in our city that we put a lot of time and energy into are not quite there?
Like you have an answer.
It's the West Chase one, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, at some point, I think it would be helpful to look at things that are moving forward and figure out what's different.
Sure,
And maybe the economics are totally different.
yeah.
Maybe it's a combination of factors.
Maybe it is, but I'd like to know. I'd like to know, where this is a session to educate us on barriers to redevelopment. I'd like to know why some seemingly similar, and you may tell me they're not similar at all, Matt.
Yeah,
Okay, fine. I'm totally open to it. I think we need to have that conversation.
yeah. No, it would be interesting. I know that article is being circulated around city staff. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. But one thing that my team has been doing some research recently, benchmarking other communities that are in a similar stage. And one thing that has been interesting that we have found is that there are several communities that we spoke to that have had some big projects, maybe like that one, that have been successful. And when we asked them, like, what was the key to your success? The bottom line was kind of right place, right time, right investor. Like there was somebody who loved that community and wanted to invest in it, and the ROI didn't matter as much as it would to the average Joe Blow investor. Or they had an elected official that just went guns blazing on something and made things happen. And in a lot of these cases, they were not things that could be replicated. And so that is something that we are thinking about and trying to figure out, like, so what do we do about that? But I think that is an interesting case, and it is an interesting question of what is different about that from, you know, some of the situation out here. I don't know what their land costs are. I don't know what the, what they were asking for that property. I know that is a challenge with our sites. It's just what those current property owners are asking for the land and what can be put in there. I think I recall hearing there was gonna be like 2,000 multifamily units that were gonna be part of that redevelopment. And so that is one way that they are able to make that cash, you know, make that work. I don't think that kind of proposal would be perceived or received well here. And so that's, you
Yeah, I
know.
don't disagree with that. I just think it needs to be in the conversation.
Sure.
And you know, I think we would benefit from that collectively.
Mhm.
I also think it's helpful. I mean, obviously, you're gonna have to have talking points and stuff, but it's helpful to in communications with the community.
Mhm.
Well, what's going on there? Get a new city center. And even if that's a teachable moment for us to say, well,
Yeah,
you know,
well, I mean,
here's the reason.
I say, yeah, we were circulating around today, and we can definitely call, especially with who it is. And that's what we tried to do on our side in this whole process of getting more acclimated to redevelopment, is calling those other cities that have done project to see how long it took. Like, I think we read it started back in like 2018, like how long it actually takes, what were all the caveats, because that's how we will learn, and that's how we'll understand what.
And I know there's a TERS involved in that
Oh,
too.
sure, yeah, and they're also different, but we could definitely reach out and report back. a
I
little
think
bit.
we So thank you. I appreciate the discussion.
no, and I think another example we were talking about, was like our mall and thinking about redevelopment of our mall, and they're the same owner as the Woodlands Mall. And so, you know, we would love to see them reinvest in our mall the way that they've reinvested in the Woodlands. And kind of what we got was, well, there's a lot we could do there that we don't really know if Sugar Land is open to, you know, adding residential and doing other things. And so,
Let me ask a question along those lines. We had a reputation, for lack of a better word,
Mhm.
of being difficult to work with
Sure.
for a long time. How do you fix that?
I mean, I.
Demonstration.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, and I would be willing to bet some of the slowness we're seeing right now, is that a part of historic difficulty or the
Trying to over.
perceived-
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah,
Adoption.
I feel like still the
I
financial
don't think
situation is still.
You don't think so?
There's
When
been a-
when you're talking about large developments, you know, cost of land is negotiable. When they're bringing in the money, they're gonna sit at the table and negotiate. I think it's the infrastructure.
Mhm.
It's the infrastructure around where that property is located, what can you do with it, and how do you do? And some of the things are, you know, can you pick up a railroad and relocate? I don't know.
Yeah.
Sure.
Do you wanna go under? Yes, then you have to start a conversation about, you know, in the event of an emergency, what are you gonna do? You have to think really long term, that it's not just about pouring money and making it happen. You can pour money and make it happen anywhere, and it will become a center of attraction. But certain things you just can't move. So you have to plan and solve that problem first. And I think it's infrastructure. From what I see and what I hear every day.
Observations. Some of the things we also think about is that, you know, if you want to reuse an existing building, let's say, a lot of times they're not built, well, rarely ever, never are they built to the code of today, right? And so there are costs that are associated with bringing it up to the new code. We're also seeing in a lot of places where new codes require additional detention or stormwater management because of the Atlas 14 changes. Where even in places that they thought that they had what they needed to address that stormwater, the new requirements say, no, you have to have even more. Our subdivision regulations, you know, we talk a lot about the zoning, but there's also the subdivision regulations, which tell property owners how to subdivide their land. They're really suburban in nature. I mean, they talk about, certain widths of the right of way and house lot size, not house sizes, but lot sizes. And so they don't support denser development, which is really the direction we're trying to move. And so, we need to transition from that allowance for cul-de-sacs to, for example, requiring grids. It's just one example of where the suburban and the little bit denser, more urban development patterns differentiated. And then there's also other standards that create more suburban layouts, like our landscape buffers. You have to have a 20-foot landscape buffer adjacent to the street, or the location and the quantity of the parking, building setbacks, signage. It's all really oriented toward your more suburban development. And it's hard to then intensify or densify a site because you're trying to put buildings on top of things that have required setbacks or landscaping or whatever. And then the last one we're going to talk about is the community being a barrier to redevelopment. So our aging community, just the age of the people who live here, influences what our market is and what retailers want to come forward, what makes sense from a redevelopment businesses, services standpoint. We also, as you know, have a hesitancy of some of our residents to see change. Change is hard. And, so that density, the multifamily conversation is really difficult. And we have people that would like to just kind of see things stay the same. And so that can scare developers, right? Anybody who might consider doing something, they know that they're gonna face that pushback. We also heard from our stakeholders that the lack of the unified vision for mixed-use development or redevelopment, kind of between developers, staff, and public officials, is a barrier to redevelopment. And then, of course, the multifamily residential issue is a big one. And so that's kind of a summary of the different types of the barriers to redevelopment. So now we're going to talk about how we can overcome some of those barriers to redevelopment. So we talk a lot about Imperial and Lake Point. Those are our big redevelopment priorities. But we really want to create an environment that is conducive to redevelopment, so that it's not just those two sites that we're talking about, but also those other areas. And so what we want to do is align our land use policies with incentives and with our capital projects, so that we can have some synergies between them to create that environment for redevelopment. We as a city, all those barriers that I just went through, there's really only this much that we actually have control over. And then a little bit more that we can influence or have a role in. But there's a whole lot that we just, the broader economy, the presidential election, like that's just something we have to kind of live with, that we can't really do anything about. And so really, I think it makes it that much more important that we really do look at those areas that we have some control and responsibility over, and do what we can to address those barriers. And the commission in particular, your role is to make recommendations on policies and regulations that will enable redevelopment. So your part in this is fairly specific. It's pretty narrow in scope, but we just want to give you kind of an overview of the bigger picture. So as we are having these conversations, you really understand the breadth of the issues and how complex they are as we're going forward. Oh, that is not what it looked like on my screen. I don't know what happened here. But this is a graphic that was in our land use plan. It looks different. I've kind of retooled it a little bit, but we called it the spectrum of redevelopment. And so basically, the city can get engaged in overcoming barriers to redevelopment in kind of a spectrum. So from limited to moderate to extensive. On the limited side, it's, you know, encouraging redevelopment in the comprehensive plan. It's having kind of a general idea of potential sites that you might want to redevelop. So I would say, you know, we can kind of check that off. We've definitely done the limited side of this spectrum. When you get into the more moderate, we've done some of these as well, but we want to see ourselves doing even more of this. So targeting specific areas in order to establish a more detailed redevelopment vision for a particular area, conducting site-specific studies, providing financial incentives, actively pursuing patient capital and initiating conversations with the private sector. So I know it's hard to see this and I apologize. We can get you guys a better version of it. If you'd like, we can send that out to you. But I've bolded the ones that are the ones that the commission is more involved with versus the others. And then on the more extensive side, the city can initiate a capitalist project, like a capital project, to entice private development to a particular area. Modify existing or creating new zoning regulations, which is something that we've been involved with Lake Point, like Matt mentioned earlier. Establishing and initiate specific redevelopment plans for particular areas. So again, we've historically been in kind of that limited and kind of reaching into the moderate. And I think as we move forward, we're realizing we've got to do even more in that moderate and even into the more extensive approach so that we can see some movement on redevelopment in our community. So again, this was the kind of the list of the types of barriers that I went through. And as I mentioned, we as a city, really the regulatory piece of it is really the one that we control. And again, that's as the city, you know, I don't control that by myself. Obviously, you guys make a recommendation, city council has to make a decision. But all the other ones, we don't have direct control over, but we can do some work to try and influence them. And so that is what we're going to talk about next. And so I think this is where I hand it off to Jessica Dewey, so you guys can hear from someone besides me. No, Jessica Rodriguez. I'm sorry, that was your old name. That's okay.
I answer to anything and never legally changed my name anyway. So there you go. Good evening, commissioners. We're going to talk about regulatory barriers. For some reason, I always get to talk about regulation no matter what I am doing in life. I don't know what that says about me, but I guess it says a lot. Sorry, going back to there. So this starts with, importantly, like updating our zoning for redevelopment. Y'all know that, y'all have been with us through parts of those processes. It comes with the predictability and high quality that we would expect, that predictability that we have to our customers, to our citizens, to our contractors of what is going to be that outcome. We did some of that earlier in the year with like the CUPs of adding in what was some of that predictability that we kept seeing that was like coming out of recommendations from the commission and then getting approved by the council. It can also be seen in like streamlining our processes because time is money in these situations for developers. And then also for, you know, high quality of taking like things that we work with economic tools and design and having that support our land use plan. We know what our land use plan says and what that guiding document is, but what are the pieces and parts that we can put together? And then also these things happen on an incremental level. As I mentioned before, y'all have done so many things, I think beginning with the alcohol overlay district to have those incremental things. So this is why I brought these things up here. So just imagine like, you know, these are just like 3 things that you've done and now you've gotten 8. And look how much of a difference, right, that makes over time. So small impacts, little by little, making big changes. So this is a quote that came out of the RAC and NAC implementation phase for recommendations. It says a community should proactively adopt zoning tools designed to incentivize, encourage, and require the types of development that it wants to see rather than creating workarounds using zoning tools originally intended for other purposes. For so many years, Sugar Land as a city we've zoned for the things we don't want. And we've been really successful at that, specifically in our planned developments. And this isn't just a Sugar Land thing. Almost all communities zone for things they don't want to see to have that land use control. In continuation, it says in particular, creating tools that allow preferred development to occur by right rather than going through expensive and unpredictable review procedures can be a powerful incentive for achieving the type of development that a community wants to see. Changes that we need in regulation that are coming up. We've often talked about how we want to bring different amendments to you for the development code. Those start within our zoning regulations, and within our zoning regulations, we don't just have our land use tools that say what you can and can't do. We have things like our landscaping regulations. We have things like our parking regulations. Our parking regulations, you know, instead of having these like minimums parking regulations that look at 80% of maybe what's a peak demand on that site and bringing it down to something that's a little bit more reasonable. We all know how those retail trends have been. So perhaps it's on the retail side, we don't have as much parking. But maybe on the restaurant side, that's not the case, because we all know if we've got a really popular restaurant, it could be difficult. Landscaping, Ruth mentioned before, we have these 25-foot landscape buffers. Those types of widths maybe don't necessarily lend themselves to any sort of like maybe infill development or redevelopment. So we're looking at this applicability matrix that would allow for like incremental like improvements that we see. So if somebody's only maybe like changing the facade or redoing some of the parking, does that mean like we have to go through and do full blown like assessment of everything in our code which makes it impossible for them to develop? Or is it just these like small tools, these incremental changes that we want to see that's going to spur? Because if I'm doing something on my property and now maybe my neighbor gets jealous that they want to do something too, and then there we go with those like big impacts that we'll get. Our sign regulations, we don't often think about our sign regulations, but you know, just in certain corridors, maybe having that visibility on there and like rethinking that like for our businesses. We also look at our design standards in hand with our subdivision regulations. Ruth had mentioned this before of having those things in alignment. You went forward and made a great recommendation on the Lake Point redevelopment district. Well, how do we have those subdivision regulations and design standards that have our engineering principles? How do those align for less suburban development? And we're looking at it towards urban development and just having a plug and play, not something specific that comes along and we develop it, but hey, I want to do this. All right, let's flip through the book. We've already got that in place for what we want to do for you. Saving time, saving money. What are some other cities doing? We look at Plano, we look at Arlington with having these different revitalization products, some on the neighborhood side, some on the commercial side, and with Plano basically, you know, saying that it's been such a positive impact to surrounding neighborhoods, kind of like, hey, like I just said, this is what you're doing, this is what I want to do. And then really focusing on our form versus use. We're always very focused on our uses that we have in our land use table, but looking at that from a different like standpoint of what is it visually looking like with the community rather than, oh, we have multifamily here, but looking at it from that standpoint. And lastly, we have our collaboration that we've had with our HOAs and POAs. In 2023, Gensler did a study for First Colony, and in that came out some things with some recommendations for them. The city has been working with First Colony as they are moving into the future with maybe trying to ease up on some of their restrictive regulations. So with that came about of like a mixing of like the facade materials. And that was like combining some of the brick that they have, and maybe that's like painting it for a more contemporary look, looking at some modern colors, brand expression, they said through signs, brand expression, meaning like you could have a logo on a sign. Some of the HOAs and some of the POAs don't allow that. I don't know how widely known it is, but Amazon wasn't allowed to put the smiley face that we all see on the box when we get a package from Amazon because of property owner restrictions within the business park. So those are things that we need to work with hand in hand, because on the city's regulation side, we don't care about logos. We just care about how big is that sign and what kind of visual impact it's going to make. So working with them and then having these like wow moments, whether that's through structures, whether it's through fountains, whether it's through water features or colorful murals, things that people want to like gather and be at a place. We have some of those features right here outside in the plaza, so we know what that looks like. How can we translate that and have it in other areas of the city so we have gathering places? So with that, we're gonna talk about addressing challenges with the property owners, and I'm gonna hand that off to Jessica Hubble. She's gonna finish this presentation.
And so just a reminder, so when they created our department, they combined long-range planning and an arm of economic development. So just a reminder for anyone who may have missed that. So I'm going to talk about more of that aspect, even though it doesn't necessarily impact y'all directly. It's still a big piece of what we do and things that we offer and how we kind of approach some of these issues. So first and foremost, overcoming barriers with property owners. The biggest thing, I believe you brought it up, sir, is how do we combat, potential old feelings or old assumptions that they have of our city. And a big part of it is building relationships. I mean, my team, it is a part of our job to get to know all of our property owners and have conversations, understand what their struggles are, understand where we can't help them and fully acknowledge that, but where can we help you and how can we move it forward? And so we spend a lot of our time doing that. Proactively seeking out new development partners and redevelopment professionals to pair up with. We are always talking to developers and if we see projects pop up, we reach out and we find out, why can't that happen here? What are the barriers here? Why wouldn't that work? Sometimes it's just the amount of land we have, right? Like they need a bigger parcel. It could be our rules, you just never know, but we are always reaching out to people to find out how we can get them interested in here or if they, whatever, consider coming. And then big thing is engaging properties to determine what kind of improvements they would make if they could, if the city would incentivize it, or if the POA would allow it, what would they want to do? Because to Ruth's point earlier, some of them, they don't really want to do anything and that's perfectly fine, right? But there are some that have some thoughts of what they want to do, but there might be a barrier and what can we do to get through that? So a big part is just the relationships and having that open dialogue. And then when it comes to the financial aspect, so for those of you who may not know, here in Texas, we have the ability, depending on your city, to have access to a portion of our sales tax money to be utilized to encourage economic development. So here in the city of Sugar Land, we get 1/4 cent of every dollar distributed back to the city from your sales tax, and it's split between our 4A and our 4B corporation. So our 4A corporation, it's pretty restricted. It has to be for business enterprise, infrastructure related to jobs, like there has to be a headquarter tied to it. So it's quite restrictive. Type or 4B, which is what Devin on our side oversee, can do everything that 4A does, but also quality of life. It has a bit more I would say leeway there. It's what created Constellation Field. That's what funded that. And so it's a bit more flexible. So we do all of these things and more to try to encourage economic development and business in our community. Public-private partnerships is the biggest one. To the point earlier about catalyst projects, Town Square was ultimately that. The city chose to build their city hall here to try to help that development go. Same with Constellation Field and SMART. The point of the city owning those and pursuing those was to drive economic development there, right? To be the project that got it off the ground. And so more of like the business side of things, direct incentives, sales tax rebates, hypothetical pension initiatives, tax abatements, those are all tools to help a business land here, stay here, keep them here. Infrastructure reimbursement agreements, to the points, infrastructure is incredibly expensive. And so the good thing about 4A and 4B, it can be utilized for infrastructure. That's ultimately what it's kind of best for. And so how can we take that cost burden away from the developer and take that on ourselves, because it is a huge burden. We create obviously financing districts or zones, like we have 3 TERSs. This is a TERS, it's a tax increment reinvestment zone. We have some PIDs, obviously there's MUDs. And I think I mentioned last time, we're exploring any type of financial tool out there. When we see a project that pops up or that we find interesting, we typically try to figure out how it's financed, what tools they use to make that happen, and then figure out that's something that we should consider or bring forward for recommendation. And then just on like the smaller scale, but incredibly impactful, is like our fund grant program, our joint CIP. This is in partnership with our POAs and HOAs. They can apply with a project that adds to the aesthetic or increases mobility or enhances their infrastructure. And we will reimburse back to up to 50%, up to $75,000. So this last year we had 7 projects. The city committed around $300,000. The total investment from the public was 800,000. So again, it's a piece. We're trying to fill a gap to encourage that redevelopment. And then pilot programs that we have. So Great Homes is the residential reinvestment program. Again, pending the age of your home, you can get either 10% or 25% on exterior home renovations. Because again, we need to be competitive and keep investing in our community. You know, your house is your biggest investment really in your life for the most part. And so we want people to encourage them to keep reinvesting. We actually extended this when Beryl happened to make sure that people could utilize this to potentially help any damages that Beryl caused that weren't covered by insurance. There were a lot of fences down in our community. And we saw a big increase in the utilization there too. And so far this year, we've had 124 projects approved for Great Homes. The total commitment from the city is around 307,000 and the total project cost is 2.2 million. So again, it's a small piece of city funding, encouraging big improvements into our community and into our neighborhoods and letting people be proud of their homes, right? And liking what they see. And to what I think Ruth mentioned earlier, we have definitely seen when somebody does the Great Homes on their home, their neighbors get jealous and then they start to, you see the trickle. We track it through GIS and you'll see clusters of home improvements all around the city. It's really neat. And then our newest commercial revitalization grant was just approved last week by the 4B board. And so this is to combat those aging commercial centers. A big comment that we hear back from the property owners is they would consider it if the city incentivized it and their POA would allow it, which is fair. And so our part is the incentivizing. And so they can get up to 20% back on eligible project costs that either spur economic growth, enhance the community aesthetic, add mobility elements to the site, take down some of the unused parking. And so we're hoping that we'll get some good interest here. We've had 3 or 4 property owners already reach out saying that they're interested. These will take time. You got to kind of build what you want to do. Some people have been sitting on things they want to do, but for others, it'll take time. And this is limited to centers that are over 20 years old, because again, we're trying to combat the aging ones. And then of 15,000 square feet in leasable space, which is a good portion of our city. So we will see what comes from that. And then overcoming the community concerns. So a big part of this is just that community engagement and education. You know, we go out often to HOAs and community events to just try to educate people on what we're talking about, try not to make it so scary about redevelopment and the change that we're wanting to see. Because that's all we can really do, right? Is just to be a voice and listen to people and hear their concerns and figure out how we can help them maybe ease some of those concerns. Small area plans. So, you know, a lot of work was done on the land use plan from many of you in here. And we're not talking about reopening the land use plan by any means, but what we can do are do small area plans. So you can do a more targeted planning effort in certain areas. And it actually brings in the community. A lot of our city was master planned. Not a lot of community involvement when it came to how like Imperial was laid out, First Colony was laid out, things like that. So small area plans can actually bring in the community around it, bring in market realities, and then actually discuss plausible outcomes. What does the community actually want to see? How do they feel about certain development? And then you can use that to hopefully try to steer some development there.
Looking back at what we did at the First Colony Mall with the Little Woodrows, you'd label that a success, right?
But
Huge success. I mean, it's a great thing.
their first month, they've stopped like 40,000 people their first month. Yeah, and I think, you know, you guys have done a lot of really great things, and we hear that from our property owners. Like anytime a code update is made, we send that to our property owners, especially the ones that have had issues in the past or concerns in the past. The one that allowed certain alcohol in commercial, what was it? The wine one? We sent that out to people and just said, hey, you know, you said we were difficult before, this has been changed. So now what do you want to do? Let's talk. And so we proactively go out and we're like, okay, we took that complaint away. What's next? You know, so no, there's been great things done. And even the mixed use code, that being adopted, we've heard a lot of feedback of like, I can't believe you guys did that, but that's amazing. You know, let's see what we can do. And so all of those things are what help us have these conversations, because people want to see action, right? They want to see you actually follow through with what you say you want. And some people are waiting for that. And that's fair. But yeah, we send out all that communication for sure. And then ultimately those small area plans can they can be updates to the land use plan or comprehensive plan. and kind of serve as an extension of the mobility master plan. Because again, these would bring in like how you move people around in that area. It'd be a much deeper look, a more intensive look. And then Ruth's going to go into the next workshop.
Can I ask you a question?
Please.
There was something about service colleges. Right?
What was it?
Was it
Risk.
What happened to that?
It's still there. It's still around. It's just, I think,
With the
yeah.
approaches, they're having to work with landing approaches like through FAA, so it's gonna be a while before.
Yeah, I mean, it's still live. I mean, I think there's a project page on the city website or the airport, but I don't think the launch, it's kind of a pun, the kickoff date is in a few years. There's a lot of regulations you have to go through.
It's 2030.
Yeah, I think it was 2030.
2030 for Sugarland.
The technologies.
All right, are you wanting to do it? Did you like that one?
No, I thought it was.
Tomorrow.
It's 2 to 3 years.
Sugarland was the pilot community.
Yes, I believe so, yeah. But that's the thing too, a lot of these take a lot of time. And so I think that's a really hard thing for a lot of, many people to understand is that these things they take a lot of time, which is a good thing because you don't want, especially development, like Lake Point or Imperial happening overnight. But I think when we could actually start to see the incremental changes, it'll take that hesitation away. But yeah.
Yeah, so we're gonna talk a little bit more about kind of community concerns. That's really what our whole next workshop is about, is public input in a NIMBY world. So that's just kind of to tee us up. It's a teaser for our next and final workshop in this series. We will continue to look for opportunities for these educational workshops. I hope that they have been helpful. We've got one in mind that we may be bringing to you sooner than later, but for now, we will wrap up with this series at the end of October. So I'm going to answer any questions that you might have.
Okay, thank you, Ruth, Jessica, and Jessica. Appreciate it very much. We will move to item.
Good night. I had a couple questions. Sorry, should have just jumped right in. Thought you were gonna bring the heat first.
No need to bring any heat.
So I have two questions. One is or the first is I'm curious if does the city have a handle on based on the city's demographics, what impact those have on potential projects? And any impact like the most diverse city in the country, or however you measure that, we're at toward the top of those lists, right? Spending patterns, things of that nature that can really impact project development. So that I'll just leave that hanging. I'm not asking you to comment on anything specific there because I can't imagine you're prepared to do that. But I have to believe that the unique demographic makeup of the city has a tremendous amount of impact on potential projects. And Jessica, you're shaking your head. So,
Definitely does.
so anyway, that's just I hope the city has a handle on it. So maybe it's more of a comment than a question. The other question that I had was, you said, Ruth, that this body's role is very narrow in scope. I'm curious if any of your benchmarking against other cities has surfaced a more active role that a group like ours could play in redevelopment.
I don't think so. I'm just trying to think again from like a standpoint of what the state statutes and typical orders sort of authorize for these boards and commissions to do. That's not to say that you can't be given other tasks, but I mean, your scope is kind of limited.
Yeah, so obviously we're going to be constrained by the statute.
Right.
Without a doubt.
Right.
I guess maybe it's just a lingering question for you guys to think about and others. if it, there's a demonstrated track record among the folks that show up a couple of times a month that I have to believe are come with an informed perspective about this stuff that is, you could make an argument we're underutilized. And so if, I mean, what you're putting forward here is it's substantial, right? It's recasting a vision for the city and, so maybe just, some thought from you guys at some point about, if you're thinking is unconstrained about project development and, building relationships with developers and all this thing, trying to rethink how we do all this, I would encourage you all to rethink the role that this group plays as well. Because, again, we're showing up and so we may as well
No, and
play roles.
I think that is a direction we've started to head, and I think we've started to ask ourselves that question of what can we bring to the commission more than what we have? Because traditionally it has been very based on development applications and a lot of, it's whether it's a zoning application or a plat or whatever. And so we have started having some of those conversations of how do we bring more to you and use you maybe more on the planning side than on the zoning side, more in that visionary type work than, still obviously you still have the role of the zoning regulatory side of things. But I think as the development planning team starts bringing some development regulations changes, I would anticipate that being, a heavy lift for this group. Although it'll be probably different than what we've done in the past, because I think like Jessica kind of talked about, I think we want to try and do little pieces at a time instead of trying to bring like a whole big code change all at once, but just kind of, okay, let's tackle this piece of it and then go forward. And then let's tackle that piece of it and go forward. And so I think that's going to be a big part of your efforts going forward, but it's noted.
So I'll just.
Thank you for offering to do more work.
I'll stop here, but just expanding the thinking with a hypothetical, which if redevelopment is the focus of the city, the number one priority of council, like said time and time again, why is there not a redevelopment commission for the city, right? Where maybe we could play a role of interacting with potential developers, building the relationships, developing that familiarity. Anyway, I don't know what that could look like, but that's the type of thinking that I think needs to sit side by side with the work that you guys are doing in sort of your daily course of action. And so would just encourage you all to think in that direction.
And along those lines, in the slides here, you were talking about, which was a little bit different than when we were putting some of the mixed use codes together, was around creating a more specific vision for the area. Right, so getting maybe more detailed in what, you wanted to look and the feel
Right.
for that area. But what are your thoughts about how that would be developed? Is this group, would that be a part of what we could do in helping with that vision? Or you're thinking that would have just been your conversations like with the developers, but.
No, so that actually, I'm glad you asked that question. So with a small area plan, it would not be developer driven. It would be looking at, like, let's say the town center regional activity center. So it's not that we have a specific application coming forward. It's not that anybody is asking for a specific amount of money or zoning or something, but it's just, okay, let's look at this regional activity center and let's do some visioning for what could be. Let's look 20, 30, 40 years down the road. What might the mobility system look like? What kind of improvements could we make to mobility in the area? What might it look like to have buildings where there exists large parking lots today? And working with the property owners in the area to come up with those visions. And then also residents in the area and, the city as a whole, but really targeting engagement with the people in the area and directly around it. And then establishing that a little bit more detailed vision. So we have a very high level vision, the comprehensive plan. So this would be like taking it down to another level, but it would still be a policy document, not a regulatory document. So you still would need the zoning then that would actually be the regulations that would support. So kind of going back to what Jessica was talking about, of having regulations that really implement the vision that's in place. So it kind of would enhance the vision that exists today.
And the small area plan would bring in the market feasibility
Right.
too, because what we don't want to do is get the community sold on something that may never happen, right? So it's like, what is like path 1, path 2, path 3? What are the plausible ways that it could go pending how the world continues to evolve?
Right.
So it's a bit more detailed.
Other comments, questions?
Anything else? All right, thank you again. Thank you, commissioners, for a great discussion. We will now move on to item 5A. P and Z Commission liaison reports. Anyone here have the September?
I had both and there's nothing pertinent to this group to report.
Thank you for that, scintillating. 5B city staff reports.
Yeah.
Well,
Some sarcasm.
So a couple of things, so your next meeting will be October 8th. We will have a plaque coming forward. So I know it's been a while, and so Jessica is gonna be giving you a little review of the plaque part of that. And we have another thing that we've been cooking up, which is a sign overlay district. So we're putting the finishing touches on that, and those will be your 2 items at your next meeting. Then we have the conference, which will be in mid-October, and I owe you kind of an overview of all the things that will be going on with that. So stay tuned for that email. And then we'll have our second meeting in October, which will be coming back with the last installment of the workshop series. So that is all I have for you.
There's something else that I received an email on, open act information.
Public information.
October 10th,
Open.
and those who can't attend can do words with, right?
Watch a YouTube video.
You can watch a YouTube video. There is an open session, I believe, where you're welcome to attend in person, but you can also accomplish that.
Is there a timeline on that video?
I don't recall. Coming from 90 days within 90 days of requirement. Okay.
Lisa, are there any commissioners that have already completed that training?
There
Yes,
are
there
some.
are.
I have. I've had
Would you like to enter that in for the record? Wow.
I believe, Mr. Cheever as well.
Hour long.
I'm a slacker.
Hey, I was hoping I was gonna be the only one.
Sorry.
It doesn't take that long,
You're
an
a
hour
good
or so, right?
You can play and you went and watched Vince.
That's Commissioner Brown, by the way.
Yes.
That was Commissioner Brown.
Thank you.
Please, if you've not completed your training, myself included, even though I've done it in years past, we will all make our
Yeah.
best efforts to pay attention and complete it. Thank you. Anything else?
That's all. Thank you.
Motion to adjourn.
We got a motion to adjourn by Landine. I've got a second from Commissioner